Hey there, folks. Welcome to yesterday's news for November 15th, 2018. Not actually going to talk about anything that was in the news today, but if you circulate in the YouTube sphere where I do, you may or may not have heard that Steven Crowder has announced that he's taking some time off to seek treatment for an autoimmune disorder, some unspecified autoimmune disorder with ambiguous symptoms, talking about fibromyalgia and things like that. And it struck my attention because not only have I noticed there's a lot of people out there with things like this, it actually happened to me at one point as well. And so I'm going to clarify a few things real quick and then tell my story. So there is a class of disorders caused by allergies, it appears. I have not been able to find any good scientific research, but there's a lot of people. I've personally known other people with similar symptoms, with similar issues, and there's a lot of chatter of this kind of thing going on, but it's really outside the wheelhouse of modern medicine, so they don't do a real good job of understanding it, and they do an even worse job of treating it because adding drugs to the situation usually makes it worse. So that's something to consider. So these sort of clandestine allergies, I might say, don't cause anaphylaxis. But they do cause inflammation in other places, either joints or the brain being a big one, and that can cause all sorts of symptoms. So if you've been diagnosed with autism, or somebody you care about has been diagnosed with autism or fibromyalgia or rheumatoid arthritis or a number of other things, it might actually be this. So it's not guaranteed to be this. So don't, there's a lot of people who know somebody whose kid was diagnosed with autism. They got their diet fixed and they were all better, and then they run around telling everybody that autism doesn't exist. Some people are actually autistic, but the symptoms of this sort of chronic low-grade allergy can mimic the symptoms of autism. And in my case, had the symptoms gotten as bad at their worst, had I had those symptoms when I was a child, I would have probably been labeled autistic. So that is something to consider, that it's not guaranteed that that's what it is, but that is what it could be. So it's worth checking out. And before I get too far into it, you can check out, Jordan Peterson has the same issue, which is why it's interesting. There's other prominent people with similar issues, and his daughter Michaela has a much worse version of it. And but there's lots of other people out there with it. And if you have one of those disorders that I mentioned, or you think you have symptoms like that and your doctors don't know what's going on, they're not being helpful, and they're just giving you random drugs, it might be worth trying. So the carnivore diet is survivable for most people, and that basically, one of the things I was allergic to was a type of meat. It was pork. So but it is possible to live on nothing but beef, and that that can help you at least identify yes or no, is this the real problem. I couldn't do carnivore. It didn't agree with me very well. But anyways, so I'm going to tell you my story, and hopefully it will encourage you, and maybe you can have the same thing happen to you that happened to me, which is an actually very good ending. So in retrospect, I probably had this issue in childhood as well. not as severe. It kind of got worse over time. But I always had little symptoms that I just chalked up to growing pains, basically, because I hit 6'1" at 14, and so up until that point, I mean, I was just constantly growing, and then it was just kind of the default answer when I didn't feel good, But then I went off to college, and life changed, and I started getting really sick. And for about a year, between my third and fourth year of college, I basically got to where I was like I had the flu every day. I was sleeping 14 hours a day. My hair was getting brittle, and it's always thin. My hairline has not actually moved. I'm not actually losing my hair. It's actually been that high since I was in high school. But my hair was getting kind of real dry and crunchy. I was getting itchy, and occasionally after I ate, I would have this episode where I'd get kind of twitchy and I'd get tunnel vision, and I would lose half my vocabulary. Very weird, very specific neurological symptoms. So that's kind of a hallmark of this thing. It's a hallmark of focal seizures. And so if you have some sort of structural anomaly in your brain and the swelling happens to localize there, then this food you eat is going to switch off some random part of your brain, which is apparently what it was doing to me. And so I would forget like common words, but I could remember, more recent things that I learned more recently. So it was, if I needed to say cup, I couldn't remember the word cup, but I could say, cylindrical ceramic vessel, so that was how weird the symptoms got. So basically constant migraine symptoms, constant, sensitivity to light, nausea, antisocial behavior. I just couldn't handle noise, and I went to a doctor. He didn't help. He suggested, because of the reaction to eating, that maybe it was reactive hypoglycemia and I should go for a low carb diet. That didn't really help, especially because I didn't know how to actually do a low carb diet. And yeah. But eventually I basically tracked it down to, I noticed I ate a bunch of pico de gallo and like completely lost consciousness. And I woke up with the, the really intense flavor of onions. And every time I'd breathe, I'd kind of get a little woozy again. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'm allergic to onions. So I cut onions out on my diet. I got, 90% better. I would still have occasional issues, but not severe. So I was all good for two and a half years, until I got my first job out of college and moved to Alabama. And my symptoms came back after about 6 months, and this time worse, and this time more random. And for years, I went back and forth to doctors, spent thousands and thousands of dollars. Thankfully, at that point, it was somebody else's money. But I still spent a lot of money on treatments and tests that didn't mean anything because they're looking for narcolepsy or whatever to try and explain my symptoms, and nobody wanted to give me an allergy test. Even the allergist that I demanded a referral to, he looked at me and he said, well, if you really had food allergies, you'd know, and you'd be afraid to have the allergy test because it'd make you swell up and your eyes would swell shut and you'd know. So I'm not even going to give you the allergy test, that was lovely. But so as that developed, the symptoms continued to kind of get worse over time. But I basically decided I just got to live with this. And, I started doing research. I kind of came back around to, I think this is allergies, but I didn't know that it was allergies. So I was having a really hard time motivating myself to do an elimination diet because it was very difficult and I felt like crap all the time and I didn't want to think about it and I didn't want to stress about it. But finally we got the company I worked for, which is Nucor Steel, they hired a company doctor, and he was awesome. And he actually took the time to try and figure it out. And when I was like, I think I'm having neurological symptoms caused by food allergies, he's like, oh, yeah, that happens. And sent me to an allergist who actually gave me an allergy test. And I actually tested positive for some allergies. But the reactions were barely detectable. So basically what seems to go on with this kind of allergies is that the swelling, it does not cause the typical, doesn't cause swelling in typical places. So in my case, it seemed to target the kind of the middle left side of my brain. But based on what I looked up, the systems that were affected, I never had an episode while hooked up to an EEG machine, so I don't know for sure. But the symptoms were consistent with a focal seizure, roughly in that area. And so the skin reaction was minimal to the allergies, especially at the time where I was just saturated with it, getting the reaction more. Like it got to the point, because I was so chronically exposed, the reactions I had were actually almost random. It got to the point where anytime I got worked up or angry, I'd have a reaction. It wasn't, even if I hadn't eaten for a day, it was because there was just so much of it in my system that any kind of rush of adrenaline would release some more of it into my system, and I'd have a reaction even though I hadn't actually eaten anything that day. So anyways, once I had confirmation that it was in fact food allergies, I was able to gather the motivation to do a real elimination diet, and was able to figure out about a list of 9 things that I wasn't able to have, and as long as I stayed away from those things, I was 99% good. Luckily, unlike Michaela Peterson, when I did have a reaction, the symptoms lasted for a few hours, maybe a few days on the worst case. So that made it much easier to handle, because eventually, after being clean for a while, I started to get more and more sensitive. So by the end, before the ending that I'll tell you about, it got to the point where I would have skin reactions, which became advantageous for a while because I was able to test things on my skin and know if it was safe to eat or not, which was really advantageous with beer because I was allergic to wheat and oats, but not to barley. So most beer was okay, but occasionally it wasn't. So I could, take a little bit of the beer on my finger and rub it on the inside of my nose. And if my nose closed up and started to burn, then I knew I shouldn't drink that beer. So that was helpful. But then, I was part of a church, and kind of have been for a long time, that believes in healing, that we pray for people to be healed, and it happens sometimes. And I'd seen it happen. I'd physically prayed for people and watched them be healed, but I just never wanted people to pray for me. I don't know why. Until somebody did when I wasn't there. And I was miraculously healed. The story is, there's more to the story, but I'm already running late. So that's about all it was. Somebody prayed for me, and I wasn't even there, and I was miraculously healed. And there was there was a delay in timing and a dream, and it was very if you believe in that kind of stuff, it's a great story. If you don't believe in that kind of stuff, I'm sure it freaks you out, because I know it freaked out a whole bunch of people that I worked with at the time, because here I am, the scientist working for the government at the time, and my my supervisor is, she saw me have reactions. She saw the time that my coworkers saw the one time when we were on a trip to an Army facility, and I had, we had fish for lunch, and they put butter on my fish, and I'm sitting there, I'm like wobbling. I couldn't stand straight. I was, really messed up. They all saw it. They all knew that I had this issue. And there I come one day, and I'm eating whatever and drinking whatever, and everything's fine. And they asked me what happened, and I said somebody prayed for me, and I'm not sick anymore. And so the skeptics just kind of like cognitive dissonance. It didn't happen, and they just kind of like always looked at me and like were just kind of still freaked out every time they looked at me. But it happens. So if you find yourself with those symptoms, well, I mean, with any symptoms, you can trust in prayer, and you can get healed that way. But if that doesn't happen and it's not your time or whatever, if you've got random, weird, specific neurological symptoms, check your diet. Try the carnivore diet. You can live on it. It's easy and not too bad in terms of it's easy. You don't feel hungry. My lower digestive system couldn't handle it, and I suspect you might have similar problems. So if you add some greens, you can basically, for a while I've done for other reasons, trying to do keto, trying to lose some weight and get a little healthier. I was doing hamburger and kale, and that worked, and it's actually really good, and I could eat that all day, every day, and be fine. So, random specific neurological symptoms or fibromyalgia or joint pain, it might be this, and it's worth a try. So, yeah. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it helps somebody. I hope it encourages somebody. I hope somebody else decides to get prayer and gets healed the way I did, because that makes an awesome story. And if you enjoyed this, like, share, subscribe, and I will see you later.